So what happens in the last 2 decades of the 19th century is that the emancipationist understanding of the war fades away and is replaced by a marriage of the reconciliationist and white supremacist versions of history. And so this coincides with the end of Reconstruction and the bargain that's implicitly struck between the North on one hand and white Southerners on the other. So the agreement is Northern whites will look the other way while white Southerners reestablish white supremacy through Jim Crow and disenfranchisement. Well, at the same time, Southerners will commit themselves, or white Southerners will commit themselves, to rejoining the nation in a spirit of unity. So the tacit or the understood view of the war, given this agreement between the reconciliationist and white supremacist versions of the history, is that this is a conflict between the blue and the gray, two equally morally valid sides, and is really characterized by the valor of soldiers who displayed the values of patriotism and of self-sacrifice. So if you look at the speech that Woodrow Wilson gave in 1913 on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, so I should point out that Woodrow Wilson is a Southern president. He's a history professor from Georgia. He's someone who plays an instrumental role in segregating the federal government, so he's a real believer in racial segregation. So this quote actually doesn't have anything to do with segregation, but it does kind of explain this vision of the war. So he says at this speech celebrating the Battle of Gettysburg, quote, "We have found one another again as brothers and comrades in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather, our battles long past, the quarrel forgotten, except that we shall not forget the splendid valor, the manly devotion of the men then arrayed against one another, now grasping hands and smiling into each other's eyes." So you sort of see this with this photograph that's taken at the time of the Spanish-American War. So the Spanish-American War is a war that's fought in 1898 between the United States and Spain. Ostensibly, the United States is aiding Cuba to gain its independence from its Spanish colonial masters, although the war, in fact, is a way in which the United States gains a measure of control over Cuba. But anyway, in this war, so this is the first war in which Northerners and Southerners have fought, in which they aren't the enemies, but they're now fighting on the same side in the same army. And so you notice on one hand you've got a Confederate soldier, you've got a Union soldier, and then in the middle is this little girl with a star on her head with the word Cuba Libres. Okay, so it's kind of this pretense that they're fighting for the independence, for the freedom of Cuba. And you see this also again in the 1930s. So this is the handbill for the 1938 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And you notice it's billed as a reunion of the blue and gray, as if, they're opposing sports teams, but they're now, after the match is done, they're coming together to shake hands and to treat each other as worthy adversaries. And so this definitely is the tone that you find in most commemorations of the Civil War, and this is typically the way professional historians write about the war in the 20th century. So the emphasis is on the motives, on the philosophy of both sides being defined as white. So the South is understood as white Southerners, and African Americans, slaves, are considered to be objects of the war, but not actors in their own right. In the South, the celebration of veterans also served the interests of promoting the cause of white supremacy. During the war, Southern women had gotten into the habit of commemorating the loss of their male relatives by staging commemoration days. That's the term they used, in which they would bring flowers to the graves of fallen soldiers, they would conduct ceremonies. And so by the end of the 19th century, as veterans were getting older, there was a sense that this practice needed to be solidified by building statues and monuments to Confederate heroes. But there was more to these statues. They were also a clear message to black Southerners. And that message was that white people were in charge. So just to give you an example of this, just an illustration of this. So here is a monument that was established in Liberty Place in New Orleans. So Liberty Place in a sort of central square in New Orleans. And it's an explicit invocation of white supremacy. So just to explain what it's commemorating, in 1874, there was a revolt by 5,000 whiteliners, by white supremacist Democrats, who took up arms to overthrow the elected Reconstruction city government. And so this monument explicitly celebrates that event. Or more subtly, you'll find in other parts of the South examples of monuments like this one. So these are monuments to loyal slaves. That's the phrase that's used. They're the loyal slaves. This is one in York County, South Carolina, but you'll find it all similar kind of examples all over the South. And so the message of this monument is that black Southerners can exist. They can remain as neighbors of their white Southerners, but they must remain servile, docile, and deferential. So it's the loyal slave, the slave who remains true to his master, who is the paragon of what Southerners believe is the proper social order. Now, the most imposing example of these kinds of monuments that were established in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th centuries is an avenue in Richmond commonly known as Monument Avenue. So it's a long, tree-lined street punctuated with monuments to Confederate generals and political leaders. Remember, Richmond is was the capital of the Confederacy, and after the war, as they're rebuilding the city, they decide that they want to establish a tribute to the generals and leaders who defended the city against invading Union armies. And so probably the most impressive of these statues is the one that is at the end of the avenue, so that's sort of the terminus of the avenue, and that's a statue to Robert E. Lee, to General Lee. When it was unveiled in May of 1890, there were crowds something over 100,000 people. Basically, much of the white population of the city congregate around the city to pay tribute to General Lee. Now, all these statues, all these monuments are built precisely at the time when Jim Crow laws and Mississippi laws are being introduced to racially segregate public facilities and to disenfranchise African Americans, often through the use of lynching and other forms of violent intimidation. So you see in this chart, there is a strong correlation between the periods in which these monuments are built. So the first wave of these monuments are built at the time in which Jim Crow laws are being introduced, at the time in which lynching is at its height, and then there's a second peak of these statues in the 1950s during the period in which the South resists the civil rights movement. So often these monuments, these statues, are erected in places of civil and political authority. So they're placed in front of county courthouses, they're placed in front of city halls, they're placed in public squares. And this is meant to communicate a clear message, both to whites and to blacks, that on the one hand, that whites are the ruling race of the South, and that blacks ought to know their place. So this is a message that was received by Robert Leon Bacon. So we're now looking at a letter he wrote to the governor of Virginia Thomas Stanley in 1955, just after the state had announced its intention to engage in what was known as massive resistance against a federal court order to desegregate public schools so that black students could receive the same quality of education as whites. So Bacon begins the letter by stating that he believes segregation's days are numbered. And he talks about the ways in which he's experienced segregation himself. So he wanted to sign up for the National Guard and he was refused because he was black. He talks about all the places in Richmond he'd like to go to, all these restaurants, all these cafeterias, and he says, I cannot eat in these places because I'm colored. Same thing that happens when he tries to get on a bus in Richmond. He's forced to sit in the rear, and he says, Virginia is the home of presidents, but it is not the home of democracy. It is the home of white supremacy. And then here he specifically refers to Monument Avenue. He says, I cannot go on Monument Avenue and visit a white girl for fear of being lynched or beaten up or arrested or electrocuted. But let some white guy come around on 2nd Street and nothing. So 2nd Street is in Jackson Ward, which is the black neighborhood of Richmond at this time. So a white guy can come around 2nd Street and nothing is done about it. But this happy regime isn't going to last forever. I'm going to chase them back where they live at. And he says the South has been dead since the Civil War. It's never been like the Great North. The South certainly did lose the Civil War. Now is the time for us colored people to rise up and demand our rights and first-class privileges as citizens should always have. Robert Bacon's letter was written at the beginnings of the civil rights movement, led by African American activists who were challenging the system of white supremacy that had been established following the fall of Reconstruction in the South. This movement, as Bacon's letter suggests, was based on a very different interpretation of what the Civil War was about. It really fit into the category of what David Flight called emancipationist, the emancipationist version of the war. So in fact, many of the events that took place during the civil rights movement fell exactly a century after the events of the Civil War. And this fact was not lost on many civil rights activists. For example, the centennial of the Battle of Fort Sumter in 1961 was commemorated by federal agencies, but it was done so in ways that guaranteed that the commemorations in Charleston, South Carolina, would be racially segregated. So perhaps the most famous speech of the civil rights era was Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream oration, which was delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963. So it's almost a century after the Gettysburg Address, delivered in 1863. And in fact, Martin Luther King's wording alludes to that very same address.
Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.